Ever feel like the questions are just too big,
Yeah.
Like too big to even fit in your brain. Like, what is consciousness anyway?
Right.
And how does our mind actually shape the world around us?
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're going deep on a theory that tries to deal with those huge questions. Integrated information theory.
Yeah.
Or, IIT for short. Now, usually IIT is presented as super scientific, right?
Yeah.
Very materialist, all about neurons and the physical brain and all that.
Right.
But what we're going to look at today is a bit of a twist.
Yeah, what's so interesting here is we've got this student researcher all the way from Idaho who's proposing that IIT might actually support a totally different view.
Okay.
Idealism, the idea that reality is fundamentally mental.
Okay, before we get too far, I want to make sure we're all on the same page here.
Sure.
Idealism, so it's kind of like saying our minds aren't just in the world, but they're actually creating it.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical shift in thinking. And there are actually a couple types of idealism that we see here. The student is exploring analytic idealism, which is about how the concepts we use shape our understanding of reality.
Okay.
And then there's subjective idealism, which takes it a step further and says that all of reality is ultimately just perception, experience within a mind.
Okay, so instead of our brains generating consciousness, it's more like consciousness is the starting point.
Right.
And our brains are just kind of how it's organized in this reality.
Exactly.
Kind of like radio, tuned into a specific station.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights a key point of alignment between IIT and idealism.
Okay.
Both of them suggest that consciousness isn't something that just emerges from complex systems.
Mm-hmm.
It's the foundation of reality itself.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. Now, IIT says that consciousness is tied to this thing called integrated information, right?
Yes.
Which is represented by the symbol I, pronounced fine. But normally they're talking about information in the physical brain, right?
Right. But this student is asking, what if isn't about neurons firing, but about how consciousness itself is structured?
Okay.
What if it measures how well a system, whether it's a brain or maybe even the entire universe, can integrate information in a unified way? Think about a pile of random Lego bricks versus a complex Lego structure.
Okay.
Say, the Millennium Falcon.
Okay.
The Falcon has much higher integrated information, a higher A.
So maybe instead of our brains generating consciousness, it's more like consciousness is this giant Lego set, and our brains are just one of the things that you can build with it.
That's a really interesting way to put it. And it gets to the heart of what the student is proposing. That IIT as a framework doesn't actually require the stuff that it measures to be physical. It could be mental.
This is where my brain starts to feel a little fuzzy.
Sure.
So both IIT and idealism are saying that experience consciousness is intrinsic, not an add-on to the material world.
Exactly. And that's a pretty big departure from the way we normally think about the mind.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
IIT talks a lot about the role of the observer in shaping reality.
Right.
How does that fit with the idea of a universal mind, which is a big part of some types of idealism, right?
That's a great question. And it takes us into some pretty thought-provoking territory. Think about quantum mechanics, where the act of observing a particle actually seems to influence its state. It's as if the observer is collapsing possibilities into a definite outcome. Some people see this as a potential link between physics and idealism, suggesting that the observer in IIT might be an aspect of a larger universal consciousness that's shaping reality through experience.
Whoa, that's a lot to process.
Yeah.
So maybe the observer in IIT isn't just a single brain, but some piece of this bigger consciousness that's shaping things through experience.
Right.
It's like we're all tuned into the same radio station, but each experiencing it in our own unique way.
Precisely. And in the students' research, they propose using a technology called BrainLM to actually test these ideas. BrainLM is a tool for analyzing brain activity and looking for patterns in how information is processed. And they want to see if it can detect patterns of consciousness that go beyond what we'd normally expect from just the physical brain.
Okay, hold on. Trying to keep up here. So we're talking about non-local effects.
Right.
Things that suggest that consciousness might not be totally confined to our brains.
Exactly. It's like trying to see if your radio can pick up signals from beyond the station it's tuned to.
Okay.
If BrainLM could find evidence of these non-local effects, it would be a major challenge to the idea that the brain is the sole source of consciousness.
So if our consciousness can do things that our physical brains shouldn't be able to do, that would be pretty huge, right?
Absolutely. It would suggest that consciousness is not just a product of the brain, but something that might be able to operate independently of it,
Yeah.
perhaps even interacting with other consciousnesses or a larger field of awareness.
All right. My brain officially needs a break. But before we get there, you mentioned that the students' research had a day 2 where they dug even deeper. What happened there?
Well, on day 2, they really dive into subjective idealism
Okay.
and how to actually test it scientifically. Remember, this type of idealism says that reality is essentially a personal experience,
Right.
which makes it pretty tricky to measure objectively.
It's like trying to use a ruler to measure a dream.
Right. Yes, exactly. But they have some ideas.
I'm guessing they have some idea.
And this is where things get even more interesting. So before the break, we were just about to get into the students' day 2 research,
Right.
and how they're proposing to use BrainLM to test some of these big ideas about consciousness and reality.
Right. BrainLM, if I remember correctly, is this advanced tech for analyzing brain activity.
Yes.
But the student wants to use it in a pretty unconventional way.
Exactly. They're not just interested in mapping brain functions. They're looking for evidence that consciousness might operate beyond the physical limits of the brain.
Okay, so they're trying to use a tool designed to study the brain to potentially prove that consciousness isn't confined to the brain.
Right.
That's pretty ambitious.
It is, and it speaks to a growing trend in consciousness research, this push to move beyond purely materialistic explanations and explore the possibility that the mind is something more than just a product of brain activity.
I'm trying to wrap my head around what those experiments might actually look like. What would they be looking for in the BrainLM data?
Well, imagine you're thinking about an old friend you haven't seen in years,
Okay.
and suddenly they call you out of the blue. That could be seen as a non-local effect,
Right.
a connection between minds that goes beyond our current understanding of physics.
So they'd be looking for those kinds of unexpected correlations, but in a more controlled scientific setting.
Exactly. They design experiments to see if there are measurable changes in brain activity that correlate with events or information that the participant shouldn't have access to through normal sensory channels.
It's almost like trying to find evidence of ESP or telepathy, but using this cutting-edge brain scanning technology.
In a way, yes. But the student is careful to emphasize that they're not necessarily trying to prove or disprove those specific phenomena.
Yeah.
They're more interested in exploring the broader question of whether consciousness can interact with the world in ways that challenge our current scientific understanding.
So let's say they find those non-local correlations in the data.
Mm-hmm.
What would that mean for our understanding of IIT and idealism?
That's where things get really interesting. If BrainLM could provide solid evidence that consciousness can operate beyond the physical brain,
Yeah.
it would lend strong support to the idea that IIT is measuring something more fundamental than just brain activity.
It would be like discovering that your radio isn't just receiving signals from local stations, but from across the universe.
That's a great analogy. And it gets to the heart of what the student is proposing, that IIT as a framework doesn't actually require the stuff that it measures to be physical. It could be mental.
This is where my brain starts to feel a little fuzzy.
Mm.
So both IIT and idealism are saying that experience consciousness is intrinsic,
Yeah.
not an add-on to the material world.
Exactly. And that's a pretty big departure from the way we normally think about the mind.
Okay, but if everything is mental, how does IIT explain cause and effect? Like, if my thoughts are creating my reality, what's to stop everything from being totally random?
That's one of the big questions the student grapples with in their research. IIT, in its traditional form, explains cause and effect in terms of physical interactions.
Right.
But in an idealist framework, we might need to rethink what causality means. It might be about how thoughts and experiences interact and influence each other within the mental landscape of consciousness itself.
So it's less about physical chains of events and more about the flow of information and intention within this larger field of consciousness.
Exactly. And that raises another fascinating question. If reality is ultimately subjective, how do we all seem to share similar experiences? Does that point back to the idea of a universal mind?
It's like we're all living in our own individual dream worlds, but those dreams are somehow connected to a shared source.
That's a very poetic way to put it. And it gets to the heart of what many philosophers and mystics have been saying for centuries, that there's an underlying unity to reality, despite the apparent diversity of our individual experiences.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling the mind-bending effects of this deep dive. But before we go too far down the rabbit hole, I have to ask, what about the practical implications?
Okay.
If BrainLM confirms these non-local effects, what could that mean for our everyday lives?
That's where things get really exciting. If we can prove that consciousness can interact with the world in ways we haven't even begun to understand it, could revolutionize fields like medicine, communication, even our understanding of the cosmos.
Whoa, that's a lot to process.
Yeah.
So what kind of revolutionary changes are we talking about?
For example, imagine being able to communicate directly with another person's mind, bypassing the limitations of language and technology.
Okay.
Or picture doctors using BrainLM to diagnose and treat mental illnesses with unprecedented precision.
It's like we're on the verge of unlocking a whole new level of human potential. But with that kind of power comes a lot of responsibility, right?
Absolutely. It would raise profound ethical and philosophical questions about privacy, free will, and the very nature of what it means to be human.
That's something we definitely need to keep in mind as we explore these new frontiers of consciousness.
Yeah.
But for now, let's get back to the students' research. Did they address any potential challenges or criticisms of their approach?
They did. They acknowledged that one of the biggest hurdles is how to objectively test something as seemingly subjective as subjective idealism. It's a bit of a paradox.
It's like trying to study a dream while you're still asleep. It feels impossible.
Exactly. But that's what makes this research so groundbreaking. It's pushing the boundaries of what we consider scientific and forcing us to question our assumptions about the nature of reality.
So they're not just challenging our ideas about consciousness, they're challenging our very definition of science itself.
Precisely. And that's why their research is so important, even if it doesn't provide all the answers. It's opening up a whole new way of looking at the world and asking questions that we might not have even considered before.
I'm really starting to see how this student's work could be the catalyst for a whole new scientific revolution. But before we get too carried away, what other challenges did they bring up?
One of the big ones is how to interpret the results of their proposed BrainLM experiments. Even if they find these non-local correlations, it doesn't necessarily prove that subjective idealism is true.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation. It just means there's a connection, not necessarily that one thing is causing the other.
Exactly. So the challenge becomes how to disentangle those correlations and figure out what they really mean. It's like trying to decipher a message from a distant star. We might be able to detect the signal, but understanding its meaning requires a whole new level of analysis.
This is definitely some next level thinking. I'm starting to feel like I need a degree in philosophy just to follow along.
Well, that's the beauty of exploring consciousness, isn't it? It forces us to engage with the big questions, the ones that have puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries.
All right, let's take a breath and recap what we've covered so far.
Sure.
We've talked about IIT idealism, the idea of a universal mind, and the potential for BrainLM to detect non-local effects in consciousness. That's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. And we've only just scratched the surface. But before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. What if the very act of exploring these questions, of trying to understand the nature of consciousness, is itself shaping the reality we experience?
Oh, okay. Now that's a mind-blowing idea. I think I'm going to need a moment to process that one.
We'll pick up that thread in part 3, where we'll delve into some of the deeper philosophical implications of the students' research and what it could mean for our understanding of the universe and our place in it.
Sounds like we're about to go even deeper down the rabbit hole. Can't wait. Okay, we're back. And my brain is still like buzzing a little from that last thought you left us with. The idea that just by exploring the nature of consciousness, we might actually be shaping reality.
Right.
That's a pretty big one.
It is, and it gets to the heart of one of the most fascinating and potentially unsettling implications of idealism.
Okay.
The idea that our minds aren't just passively observing reality, but are actually actively participating in its creation.
So it's not just that our thoughts and beliefs influence our own experiences, but they might actually be shaping the fabric of reality itself.
That's the suggestion. It's like we're all contributing to a giant tapestry, and every thought, every action adds a new thread to the design.
That's it's empowering and kind of terrifying at the same time, right?
Yeah.
What kind of responsibility does that place on us if we're literally weaving the reality that we experience?
It's a huge responsibility, and one that I think a lot of traditional scientific and philosophical frameworks haven't really grappled with.
Right.
If consciousness is truly fundamental, as idealism suggests, then our understanding of ethics, morality, even the meaning of life, might need a serious overhaul.
So it's not just about understanding the universe out there. It's about understanding the power of our own minds to shape that universe.
Exactly. It's like we've been given this incredible gift, this ability to create reality with our thoughts and intentions, but we're only just beginning to understand how to use it wisely.
Almost like we're all playing this giant video game, but we're only just now starting to realize that we have the ability to change the rules of the game.
That's a really interesting analogy, and it highlights the importance of intentionality.
Right.
If our thoughts and actions are shaping reality, then it becomes crucial to be mindful of what we're creating both individually and collectively.
Okay, so if we take this idea seriously, where do we even begin? How do we start to use this power of consciousness responsibly?
Well, I think it starts with awareness, recognizing that our minds aren't just isolated entities, but interconnected nodes within a larger field of consciousness.
Yeah.
And that our thoughts, beliefs, and actions have ripple effects that extend far beyond our individual selves.
So it's not just about, like, think positive thoughts. It's about understanding that our inner world has a direct impact on the outer world.
Precisely. And that realization can be both liberating and daunting. It means that we have the power to create positive change, but also the potential to contribute to suffering and chaos.
That makes the stakes seem pretty high. It's like we're all walking this tightrope between creation and destruction with every choice we make.
It's a delicate balance, for sure, and one that requires us to cultivate wisdom, compassion, and a deep sense of responsibility for the reality we're co-creating.
This is a lot to, like, absorb.
Yeah.
It feels like we've gone from exploring the inner workings of the brain to grappling with the fundamental nature of existence.
That's the nature of consciousness research. It inevitably leads us to these big existential questions. And while we may never have all the answers, the journey itself is transformative.
For sure. But before we wrap things up, there's one more question I have to ask. Sure. You mentioned earlier that even if we're living in a simulation, it doesn't really solve the problem of consciousness. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. The simulation hypothesis, while intriguing, doesn't actually address the fundamental mystery of where consciousness comes from.
Okay.
Even if our reality is a simulation, something had to create that simulation, something with the capacity for consciousness and intentionality.
So it's like kicking the can down the road. We're still left with the question of what's outside the simulation, what created it, and what's the nature of that consciousness.
Exactly. The simulation hypothesis might change our understanding of the form reality takes, but it doesn't change the fundamental question of the source of reality. And ultimately, that source, according to idealism, is consciousness itself.
I'm starting to realize that this whole conversation has been like peeling back layers of an onion.
Yeah.
We started with the brain, that expanded to consciousness, then to the universe, and now we're contemplating the very nature of existence itself.
And who knows, maybe there are even more layers to uncover.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of this exploration. It's an ongoing journey with no fixed destination.
Well, I think we've reached the limits of what we can cover in this deep dive. But this has been an incredible journey, to say the least. We've explored IIT idealism, the idea of a universal mind, non-local consciousness, and the mind-blowing possibility that our minds might actually be shaping reality. It's a lot to process.
It is. And I hope our listeners are walking away with a sense of wonder, curiosity, and perhaps even a renewed appreciation for the mystery and power of their own minds.
Absolutely. And if this conversation has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to dive deeper into these topics on your own. There's a whole world of fascinating research and philosophical inquiry out there waiting to be explored.
And remember, the exploration of consciousness is not just an intellectual pursuit, it's a personal journey. By understanding our own minds, we gain a deeper understanding of the universe and our place within it.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the infinite possibilities of your own consciousness.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep diving deep.